Well, thank you and good evening, everybody. Before I begin the main body of my remarks, I wish to express my gratitude to those responsible for planning and executing this evening's event. Having spent a significant majority or significant amount of my life organizing events, I do know the energy and the creativity and time that is needed to pull off a gathering of this type. So thank you very much for that. Now, my address this evening has three interrelated parts. The initial segment will take a look at what constitutes political leadership. The second brief section will try to situate BDS into a Canadian political context using some political history. And the third part, I'll make some observations about how this important matter of public policy has impacted and in part defined the present Green Party of Canada. Now, political leadership has been a lifelong fascination for yours truly, so much so that I was determined to study the matter in my honors year at Acadia University, which, by the way, is situated in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. So on behalf of Tourism Nova Scotia, I invite you to visit the friendly confines. I was particularly interested in studying the humanitarian aspects of political leadership. And what I mean by this is that I was thoroughly uninterested in the run-of-the-mill leaders that North America seemed to produce. To me, these individuals embodied and typified a classic Canadian childhood game. Do you remember the game? King of the Mountain. So the purpose played out on schoolyards across the country was typically to physically outdo your friends and reach the top of the snow pile. How one got to the top of the snow pile depended on how sharp one's elbows were and one's overall physical dexterity. So at the time, I found political leadership in my own country utterly lacking. It occurred to me that the main party leaders were little more than glorified versions or winners, if you will, of King of the Mountain. It occurred to me that this was the dominant trait of Canadian political leaders. So, using humanitarianism as a guidepost, I selected two case studies outside of North American continental politics. Nelson Mandela, then President of South Africa, and Václav Havel, the then President of the Czech Republic. Now, there were overarching similarities between the two. Both had endured extended incarceration at the hands of authoritarian regimes. Both became elected presidents of their countries under new democratic frameworks. In the case of Mandela, he had opposed an especially lethal and pernicious apartheid regime. Havel was a famous playwright who was a signatory to Charter 77, a famous human rights declaration that was signed in the face of an at times brutal Soviet puppet regime. What fascinated me about them, in addition to the compelling narrative, was how both came to see political leadership and how they differed from the predictive, confrontational leadership that was present in my own country. Mandela, for instance, saw himself as someone that was compelled to act in a leadership role because he had the requisite skills, and it was the members of the African National Congress who pushed him into the role. Aside from his expounding the origin of his leadership, another thing differentiated him, and that was revealed in the following quote. So, this is Mandela. It is better to lead from behind and to put others in front, especially when you celebrate victory when nice things occur. You take the front line when there is danger. Then people will appreciate your leadership. Now ask yourself, how many Canadian political leaders would think, let alone act, in these terms? Equally, I was stirred by Havel, who rejected the pedestrian and uninspiring politics as the art of the possible. Havel said, quote, "Let us teach ourselves and others that politics cannot simply be about the art of the possible, especially if this means the art of speculation, calculation, intrigue, secret deals, and pragmatic maneuvering, but that it can also be about the art of the impossible, that is, the art of improving ourselves and the world. So once again, I call upon you to reflect on this style of political leadership. The next time someone says that bringing an end to the immense suffering in Palestine is impossible, the next time someone tells you that sustained peace in the region is impossible, the next time someone says that it is an impossibility that a Canadian political party can espouse, advocate, and implement a policy designed to ameliorate the suffering of Palestinians, please think of Havel's politics of the art of the impossible. Now, the study of political leadership is a substantive field, and I am but merely touching on themes that resonate within me and hopefully are germane to this moment in time. Before moving on to Canadian politics, I wanted to make two simple observations about how political leadership can be sustained in a democratic context. In the absence of adequate levels of civic literacy, most of us have lost our collective ability to determine what legitimate political leadership consists of. I'm going to ask you to please remember these two traits during the final part of my address. So one hallmark is that the person or persons in question enjoy a popular mandate from the political institution's membership. This popular mandate, or leadership review, is only valid when members of the institution have access to information that permit them to make an informed decision as to the merits or demerits of the leader in question. Now, this would seem to be self-evident, but in the world of modern political parties, having a membership that has both the political and the civic literacy skills and access to pertinent information is in fact elusive. Another hallmark is that party leaders must understand the relationship to all the component parts, but namely the membership of the given institution. Does he or she respect the party's constitution? Does she or he respect the governance bodies of the party? Does the leader accept the verdict of the membership on issues of public policy that are articulated democratically and in accordance with the constitution and bylaws of the party? So, if one of these two hallmarks is amiss within a democratic party, there is a significant leadership problem. If both are present at the same time, then it is a disaster. So, two of Canada's foremost academics on political parties, Steve Patton of the University of Alberta here, and Reg Whittaker, argue that Canadian political parties are hollow shells. That is to say, they exist primarily for the edification and maintenance of the leader and their staff. All within the party is aligned for the purpose of cementing the power of the leader at the expense of other elements of Canadian democratic parties, namely the membership. So in other words, modern Canadian political parties take on the traits of glorified personality cults. Once again, I ask you to reference this as I make my remarks concerning my beloved party, the Canadian Greens. So, I'd like to move on to the Canadian geopolitical context, just briefly. So prior to looking at the situation confronting the Greens, I wish to turn back the pages of time to when the presiding Prime Minister opposed an especially egregious human rights crisis known as South African apartheid. Brian Mulroney was Canada's 18th Prime Minister. And for those of you who may not have been around or have had a chance to examine this political figure from days gone by, he was, to put it mildly, a proponent of the type of pernicious free trade that has fueled the disastrous growth of poverty in Canada, the increased stratification between the upper, middle, and lower classes began to explode, in fact, under Pierre Trudeau, but became a permanent fixture under the Mulroney Conservatives. Now, Mulroney's clumsy handling of constitutional politics witnessed the Meech Lake Accord, the advent of the GST, a tax that was regressive in concept and in delivery, and actually corruption on a very large scale highlight his historical legacy. But perhaps the one area of public policy and ethics that he actively reflected the will of the Canadian people was in the area of South African apartheid. Mulroney took considerable heat from his ideological soulmates, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, for calling for Mandela's liberation, the destruction of the apartheid system, the unbanning of the African National Congress, and the building of a non-racial democratic society in South Africa. An Albertan, Foreign Minister Joe Clark and the Canadian Ambassador to the United Nations, Stephen Lewis, were also political leaders that captured the essence of the time, that apartheid was at bottom a human rights issue. At that time and now, key figures alluded to the notion of being on the right side of history. So it has to be said, though, that Brian Mulroney was reviled by Canadians. It was only by virtue of a voting system that has produced a false majority government that he came anywhere near the Prime Minister's office. Still, on this issue, the former Diefenbaker delegate, I think it was Eves who referred to Diefenbaker. So the former Diefenbaker delegate took his cue from his political idol who had led the move to have South Africa expelled from the Commonwealth in March of 1961. So now, why is this germane to tonight's discussion, you might ask? Well, if you accept that the plight of the Palestinian people is on par or exceeds the ghastly outrages of apartheid in South Africa, and quite a few of the leading surviving figures of the anti-apartheid movement accord with that view, then Mulroney's legacy on this human rights question matters. Canada has historically had pretensions to being a middle power that could situate itself between superpowers and affect some good in the world. Perhaps the blue ribbon example of a middle power that has achieved much is Norway. Most recently, the Norwegians were largely responsible for brokering a peace deal in Colombia, the scene of a deeply embedded and long-lasting civil war. Now, I ask you to consider Mulroney's stand against South African apartheid to the current crop of political leadership and their outright condemnation of the BDS movement. There are no aspirations uttered by the Liberal Prime Minister, the interim Conservative opposition leader, or for that matter, the hapless outgoing leader of the New Democratic Party of being on the right side of history. Indeed, many of you will know of a House of Commons resolution that easily passed that condemned the BDS effort. From a public policy perspective, the current manifestation of the Liberal Party seems to be obsessed with policies that the 1980s Conservative Party would have championed, namely the Trans-Pacific Partnership and arms sales to unscrupulous countries. Now, the Conservatives are, well, sort of reminiscent of where the Republican Party in the United States has been since the advent of Bush Cheney. And the New Democrats, my former party, have descended into the abyss to the point where anyone, or virtually anyone, articulating a pro-Palestinian perspective was prohibited from running in the 2015 Canadian federal general election. Just as ridiculous, the current NDP are tying themselves in knots over the LEAP Manifesto, a document that the Green Party of Canada, as Dimitri pointed out, endorsed when it counted in the midst of the 2015 national general election. So, if you accept the analogy that the conditions facing Palestinians are comparable, that is to say even worse than South African apartheid, then on this crucial human rights issue, the governing Liberals, opposition Conservatives, and the NDP are actually to the right of the Mulroney Conservatives. Just let that sink in for a moment in historical terms. The unabashed free trader and union-busting labor lawyer took a principled stand on human rights, whereas the current Liberals, Conservatives, and New Democrats are missing in action. Worse than that, actually, at least in the case of the Liberals and Conservatives, they've actually been moved to express contempt for BDS. So Trudeau has positioned himself as a self-anointed foe of those espousing BDS, even including the rather bizarre specter of condemning students at his alma mater of McGill University for organizing and rallying around the BDS push that is increasing in momentum across Canadian civil society. Now, universities ought to be places that opinions can be expressed without fear of impingement. For the Prime Minister to be condemning people for holding opinions that run counter to his own is disgraceful in a democratic society. We, the people, ought to be summarily outraged for such a transgression of democratic norm. So, with varying parts indifference and active contempt exhibited by the Liberals, Conservatives, and NDP, the only party that seems to value and is even prepared to debate the issue of BDS is, in fact, the Green Party of Canada. So, this brings me to my last portion of my brief address. So, I'd like to spend time addressing the current situation in the Green Party. Now, in slight contrast to the findings of Patton and Whitaker, the Greens are a democratic party that is chiefly driven by its membership. Suffices to say that the party's constitution treats the decisions of members at convention as the dominant policy-making body. So, for the Green Party leader to publicly renounce a policy arrived at democratically by the membership is extraordinary. In fact, I would go so far as to say that this does not have any real precedent in modern Canadian political history. I'll just touch on the highlights. Having praised the membership of the party for its democratic vigor after the motion was passed in Ottawa, the leader then took to the media a day after the convention to say that she was ill-disposed to the policy and furthermore would resign if an about-face could not be effected. Now, this led to real and pretended uproar in the mainstream media, some of which was chronicled very ably by Dimitri earlier, and also social media. Various official spokespeople for the party cast the policy in the dimmest of terms. The Federal Council of the party, in an action that was clearly designed to override the primacy of the membership's right to make party policy, concocted the special meeting that will be held in Calgary in December, and the justification for the meeting continues to stretch the bounds of believability. So the leader of the Green Party of Canada and the Federal Council of the Green Party of Canada are acting in this way because they disagree with the membership on a matter of public policy. I would go even farther and say that the current leader and the Federal Council are in a state of conflict with the membership of the party and are acting in decidedly non-democratic ways. The leader's decision to make a matter of public policy that was decided on fairly and squarely by the membership of the party and to transform it into a matter of her political career is very telling and very revealing about how she regards internal party democracy and the use of power in the Green Party. So, knowing what we know, the question becomes, what is to be done? What is to be done? That is a question that has fascinated political scientists since Lenin uttered those words at the beginning of the October 1917 Russian Revolution. Let me say with clarity that I do not believe my fellow members of the Green Party of Canada should give in to the type of political blackmail, or to put it perhaps more kindly, brinksmanship, being exhibited by the leader of the party and its Federal Council. We are a democratic party, full stop. Being authorized as a democratic party characterized as a democratic party places an onus on members to adhere to democratic norms, even if the leadership plays fast and loose with them. Also, the Green Party of Canada is more than one person. So putting the question, what is to be done, more succinctly, in the event that the leader of the party chooses to leave that position if the members retain the BDS motion. So what happens? I have three answers to that eventuality. So the first is to reflect perhaps Dimitri's thinking a bit. The first is that we are a party that prides itself in being guided and informed by 6 key values: sustainability, social justice, ecological wisdom, respect for diversity, participatory democracy, and nonviolence. So these values, while the interpretation of them may occasionally vary, are not to be put aside as a matter of convenience. They are our guiding lights in the face of a world we wish to transform. In my view, the actions of the leadership and Federal Council represent a clear departure from and deviation from the value of participatory democracy. They are, in effect, disregarding the democratic verdict of the membership, and they are being transparently obvious while they are doing it. Now, conversely, in my view, the proper role for the membership is to uphold the democratic norms and traditions of our party. Do not be willing partners in the diminishment of our internal party democracy. Insist that the leader and Federal Council stand down from anti-democratic actions. So my second of the three answers for our overarching question is, if in fact the democratic will of the party entrenches the present BDS policy in Calgary, and this occasions the departure of the current leader, this, folks, is what happens occasionally in democratic parties. Moreover, Canadians have no real perception of the tremendous depth and talent that exists in the Green Party of Canada. We have visionary, far-seeking leaders in our midst that would excel on the national political stage. I would even say that we have an embarrassment of riches in terms of outstanding, capable people who could assume leadership roles within our party. We need not succumb to the tactics of being currently employed by the leader and the Federal Council. So, lastly, my third answer to the question, what is to be done, is an ancillary to the foregoing answer. That is to say, every Democratic Party needs periodic renewal. The Green Party of Canada has not had an official leadership contest for over a decade. In saying that, I accept the membership's verdict of earlier this year as it relates to the current leader. All I wish to state at this time is that if we were to be in the midst of a leadership contest in the not too distant future, it would be representative of an opportunity for the party and the country to experience democratic political renewal. In short, I say to my fellow members, and to hopefully soon-to-be members, do not give in to undemocratic bullying, but be proud of the BDS policy that you adopted in Ottawa. In my view, this debate, as polarizing as it has been represented at least, represents a level of maturity for the Green Party of Canada. My fellow members, visionaries and leaders all, have acted in a way that signifies an understanding that we have an obligation to help those in distress. My fellow Green Party members have understood that we cannot look away in the face of unrelenting violence. My fellow Green Party members understand that our country, Canada, can occasionally do what Havel referred to as practicing the politics as the art of the impossible. That is to say, to make ourselves and the world a better place. Thank you for your attention.